What if the death of Moses wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of something no one expected? What if his final breath didn't mark the end, but set off a chain of supernatural events that changed everything? 7 extraordinary events, some miraculous, some terrifying, unfolded in rapid succession. They would test the courage of a new leader, the loyalty of a restless people, and the faith of a generation standing on the edge of promise. And as the first of these events began to stir, somewhere in the shadows, a heavenly warrior was already on his way, with a sword drawn. This isn't just the story of a great leader who died. It's the story of what God set in motion the moment Moses left the mountain, a shift so profound that not even Joshua, Moses' closest companion, was ready for it. What followed was not merely a change in leadership. It was a divine confrontation between fear and promise, legacy and obedience, silence and revelation. Later in this video, you'll discover the mysterious event that occurred in the wilderness, a confrontation so intense that even Satan himself showed up, demanding the body of Moses. And that's only the beginning. But before we get there, we have to return to the mountain where everything changed. The greatest prophet in Israel's history stands on Mount Nebo, his eyes gazing over a land he will never enter. He had spoken with God face to face. He had called down plagues upon Egypt. He had split the sea with a staff and struck a rock to bring forth water. And yet now his final act is not a miracle, but surrender. No great army stood beside him. No crowd witnessed his final words. No nation carried him to a tomb of honor. Moses died, alone, buried by the hand of God himself. But heaven didn't rest. The angels were already on assignment. The Jordan River, still calm, would soon stop flowing. The hearts of an entire generation, once hardened by slavery, would begin to tremble at the weight of their calling. And a new leader, reluctant, trembling, uncertain, would be told the same words God spoke when the world was first created: be strong. In just a moment, we'll witness the sacred transfer of leadership, ignited by God's voice and confirmed through divine signs. We'll also uncover the hidden meaning behind why Moses had to die before Israel could enter the Promised Land, and what that says about our own spiritual journey today. This is not a farewell story. This is a threshold, a holy disruption, a series of divine events so precisely orchestrated that even the heavens responded. And what happened after Moses died might just change how you see your own calling. So don't go anywhere, because what's about to unfold reveals the hand of God in the silence, the battle behind the scenes, and the moments when we feel most abandoned, only to find out we were never alone. The journey had been long. 40 years of wandering, 40 years of carrying the weight of a rebellious people. And now, Moses stood alone at the edge of the promise, a promise he would not enter. He climbed Mount Nebo in silence, not as a conqueror claiming victory, but as a servant finishing his assignment. The mountain stood tall above the plains of Moab, and from its peak, God opened Moses' eyes to see the inheritance his people were about to receive. From Dan to Beersheba, from the lush hills to the distant sea, the land of milk and honey lay stretched before him. But this wasn't just a panoramic farewell. It was a divine moment between a man and his maker. Moses had been many things: a prince in Egypt, a fugitive in Midian, a shepherd, a prophet, a judge, a deliverer. But at this moment he was simply a son returning home. There were no chariots, no shouts of praise, no monument waiting for his body, just the whisper of wind and the nearness of God. And then he died. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 5 tells us, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord." But the original Hebrew offers something more mysterious. It implies that Moses died by the mouth of the Lord. Ancient Jewish tradition interprets this as a kiss from the lips of God himself. The greatest prophet in Israel's history didn't die by sword, plague, or age alone, but by an intimate act of divine love. A kiss that ended a lifetime of struggle. A kiss that said, "It is finished." And then, something even more astonishing. No one was allowed to bury him. No priest, no elder, no son. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 6 says, "And he," meaning God, "buried him in a valley in the land of Moab." But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Why? Because Moses didn't belong to Israel anymore. He belonged to heaven. God hid his body, not out of secrecy, but out of protection. Moses had become more than a leader. He was a symbol of the old covenant, of the law, of a season now complete. His burial could not become a shrine. His grave could not become an idol. The story had to move forward, and that's when the heavens began to shift. Because while Israel wept below, something was already stirring in the unseen realm. The body of Moses was not forgotten. It had become a battlefield. And soon, someone would come to claim it. The Bible says that God himself buried Moses. But buried him. From who and why? Hidden somewhere in the valley of Moab, guarded by mystery and silence, the body of Moses was laid to rest. But not in peace, because somewhere in the invisible realm, another set of eyes had been watching. Eyes filled not with honor, but accusation. The book of Jude, chapter 1, verse 9, opens a window into a scene so strange, so supernatural, that most believers never even notice it. It says, "But Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment, but said, 'The Lord rebuke you.'" Wait, what? Michael, the chief warrior angel, the one who cast down the dragon in Revelation, the protector of Israel. He shows up at a burial, and he's not fighting over a soul. He's fighting over a corpse. This moment, barely a sentence long, is one of the most profound confrontations in the entire Bible. It's not a vision, not a parable. It's a real event. The devil came to claim Moses' body, and heaven intervened. But why would Satan want a dead body? Think about it. Moses was more than a prophet. He was a legend, a miracle worker, the friend of God. If Satan could corrupt or misuse Moses' body, he could turn it into an object of worship, an idol, a relic, something Israel would chase instead of God. A dead body can't speak, but it can deceive. That's why God hid it. And that's why Michael had to protect it. But there's something even deeper here, something most miss. Michael doesn't accuse Satan. He doesn't hurl insults. He doesn't scream or boast. He says only one thing: "The Lord rebuke you." Why? Because even the archangel Michael knows this battle isn't about power, it's about authority. Only God has the final word over life and death. Not Moses, not Satan, not even Michael. This brief scene tears back the veil and reveals something staggering. Even in death, the faithful are not abandoned. Even in burial, the enemy may try to interfere, but heaven still watches over what belongs to God. This wasn't just about Moses, it was about the future. Because if Satan was willing to fight for Moses' body, what might he do when the Messiah is buried? This battle was a warning. The enemy wants to touch what God has sealed, but not even hell can break the authority of heaven. And we're not done yet, because what comes next will change how we see leadership, legacy, and the rise of a new generation. 30 days. That's how long Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab. 30 days of mourning a man whose face had glowed with God's glory. A man who stood between them and Pharaoh, who lifted his staff and split a sea. who descended from the mountain with fire still in his eyes. A man who had poured out his strength, his patience, and even his failures for them. But as the people grieved, there was one man who said nothing. Joshua, the successor, the servant of Moses, the chosen one. And yet, in this moment of transition, he is silent. Not a single word of his is recorded during the morning. Not one speech, not one prayer. Only stillness. Why? Because grief can be loud in the heart even when lips stay quiet. Joshua knew what was coming. He had seen the land. He had seen the giants. He had carried the weight of leadership before. When Moses was on the mountain and the people rebelled, he wasn't afraid of battle. But stepping into Moses' shadow, that was a different kind of weight. You can be ready in skill and still tremble in spirit. And yet, amid the tears of a nation and the silence of a leader, something beautiful happened. The grief did not paralyze them, it prepared them. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 8 says, "The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over." Israel honored the loss, but they did not freeze in it. And this moment is more than historical, it's deeply spiritual. There comes a time when even the strongest among us must say goodbye to what was, even to something good, even to someone beloved, and turn toward what God is doing next. The wilderness had always belonged to Moses, but the promised land, that would require a different kind of leader. Joshua didn't need to imitate Moses. He needed to trust the same God. And maybe that's why he stayed quiet. Because before you speak as a leader, you must listen to God. Before you march forward, you must mourn what came before. There's a sacredness in grieving what God once used, even when he says it's time to move on. And Joshua knew something that we often forget. When God buries a season, he never leaves the grave open. He closes it, seals it, and points to a new horizon. But the path ahead wouldn't start with strategy. It would begin with a voice. And when that voice finally broke the silence, it would call Joshua by name. And what God says next will change everything. The 30 days were over. The tears had dried, but the uncertainty still lingered. And then it happened. A voice shattered the silence, but it wasn't the voice of Joshua. It was the voice of God. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, we read, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, 'Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites.'" There was no preamble, no delay, no long introduction, just divine clarity. "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, get ready." God honored Moses, but he did not linger in his memory. He pointed forward. Because the kingdom doesn't stop when a man dies. The mission doesn't collapse when a leader falls. The promises of God are not buried with the saints. They are passed on to the next generation. And Joshua, he wasn't just next in line. He was chosen. But notice something powerful. God didn't speak until the morning ended, because God doesn't rush healing. He doesn't interrupt sacred grief. But once the season is complete, he speaks. And when he speaks, he doesn't just comfort. He commissions. The words that followed were not warm nostalgia for Moses. They were marching orders for Joshua. Get ready. God doesn't want you to live in yesterday's miracles. He wants you to walk into today's calling. And this was the moment of shift. The wilderness was behind them. The Jordan was ahead. The future wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a battlefield. But Joshua wasn't being asked to be Moses. He was being asked to be obedient. And God knew that obedience begins not with courage, but with confidence in the one who calls you. So what did God say? 3 times in the first 9 verses of Joshua chapter 1, God says it. Be strong and courageous. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Because courage doesn't always come naturally. It must be spoken into us, repeated, reinforced, breathed over our fear. And in verse 5, God says something Joshua had likely longed to hear. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. That's not just reassurance, it's the heart of leadership. Because no matter what you face, if God is with you, then nothing else matters. Heaven wasn't waiting on Joshua's strength. It was offering him God's presence. And soon, that presence would lead him not just across the Jordan, but into history. The Jordan River wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a spiritual threshold. And the people of Israel stood on its banks, watching its waters swell with springtime flood, wondering, how will we cross? But God wasn't asking them to build a bridge. He was inviting them to witness something sacred. In Joshua chapter 3, verse 7 to 8, God speaks again. Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. Stand in the river. That's not how miracles usually begin. But this wasn't going to be another Red Sea moment. At the Red Sea, the waters parted first. Then the people walked through. But at the Jordan, God reversed the order. Now the priests had to step into the water before anything changed. Why? Because this miracle wasn't just about deliverance. It was about trust. The Ark of the Covenant, the visible sign of God's presence, was to go first. Not the warriors, not the leaders, not even Joshua, but the priests. Those who carried God's holiness on their shoulders were called to step first into the impossible. And when they did, Joshua chapter 3 verse 15 to 16 says, Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. The river didn't just slow, it stopped. It says the waters piled up in a heap at a distant town called Adam. The entire river rolled back, all the way to the beginning. Isn't that what God does? He doesn't just make a path forward, he rewrites what was behind. He touches the source. And the people of Israel walked across on dry ground again. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't about escaping an enemy. It was about entering a promise. The Red Sea was the miracle of survival. The Jordan was the miracle of possession. And in that moment, something shifted. Joshua was no longer the assistant. He was the anointed. And the people weren't just wanderers, they were inheritors. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new identity. And in the silence of those steady steps across the dry riverbed, a generation walked out of the shadow of Moses and into the calling of God. Before the last priest stepped out of the riverbed, God gave Joshua a peculiar command. He said in Joshua chapter 4, verse 2 to 3, Choose 12 men from among the people, 1 from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, and carry them over with you, and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. 12 stones. It might have seemed strange. After all, the people had just seen a river stop flowing. Shouldn't they be dancing, building altars, or moving on quickly? But God wasn't finished. Because this moment wasn't only about getting to the other side. It was about never forgetting how they got there. God wanted a memorial, a physical marker in the soil of promise, a stack of stones that would stand taller than time. And it wasn't just about the people who crossed. It was about the children who hadn't seen the Red Sea. The grandchildren who didn't feel the terror of Egypt. The generations who would be born into freedom without ever knowing what it cost. In Joshua chapter 4, verse 6 to 7, Joshua explains the reason. In the future, when your children ask you, "What do these stones mean?" tell them, "The flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." Forever. Not just for memory, but for meaning. Because we forget quickly, don't we? We forget the miracles once they feel like history. We forget the prayers we once whispered in desperation when life becomes routine again. But these stones, they weren't smooth or polished. They were pulled from the river's floor, soaked in miracle, weighted with memory, and they said something without speaking a word. They said, "God brought us here." Not our strength, not our plans, not our numbers or leaders, but His presence, His mercy, His promise. And Joshua didn't just leave those stones on the far side. He took 12 more and stacked them in the middle of the riverbed, right where the priests had stood, hidden beneath the water once it flowed again, unseen by human eyes. Because some memorials aren't for people to see, they're for heaven to remember. There, under the current, lay a testimony invisible to man, but forever known to God. 2 memorials, one visible, one submerged, but both speaking the same truth. The Lord, He is faithful. The crossing was complete. The people had made it. The Jordan was behind them, and before them only Jericho stood. But God didn't send them into battle. He stopped them, right there, on enemy soil, with enemies watching. And then He gave Joshua a command that felt completely out of step with human logic: make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel. Why? Because for 40 years this nation had walked through the wilderness uncircumcised. The symbol of covenant, the mark given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, verse 11, had been forgotten. The outward sign of belonging had been neglected. And before they could fight for the promise, they had to return to obedience. So Joshua obeyed. He circumcised the entire new generation at a place they would name Gilgal, which means the rolling away. God said in Joshua chapter 5, verse 9, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." And here lies something profound. These men were already free, but not yet fully formed. They were born in liberty, raised outside Egypt, fed by manna, and sheltered by the cloud of God. But until now, they were still carrying Egypt's shadow, the residue of disobedience, the ache of incompleteness. God didn't just want them to possess the land. He wanted them to possess it as a holy people, set apart, marked, not by swords and victories, but by surrender. Because covenant always precedes conquest. And that surrender came at a cost. Circumcision wasn't painless. It wasn't private. It left the camp vulnerable for days, unable to fight, move, or defend. But that's the paradox of God's preparation. Before He strengthens, He wounds. Before He sends, He sanctifies. Before He gives victory, He demands consecration. And Gilgal became more than a place. It became a threshold, the place where pain met purpose, where obedience replaced delay, where a generation born in the wilderness finally became sons of covenant. Because God doesn't merely want us to conquer things for Him, He wants us to walk in covenant with Him. And sometimes that means returning to the places we've neglected, restoring the promises we let fade, surrendering what we've held back even when the enemy is watching, especially then. Because the power of God is not found in having the upper hand, it's found in having a heart fully His. At Gilgal, God didn't just roll away their past, He marked their future. It was quiet now. The wounds of Gilgal were still fresh, but the people were resting. And Joshua, the leader, stepped away, perhaps to pray, to watch Jericho from a distance, to prepare himself. But what he saw next was nothing he expected. A man stood before him, sword drawn, silent, unyielding. Joshua instinctively reached for clarity. Are you for us or for our adversaries? But the answer shattered every assumption. Neither, the man replied. I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. Joshua chapter 5 verse 14. This was not an angel. This was not a vision. This was holy ground. The commander didn't say, I fight for you. He said, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. Sound familiar? It's what God said to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3 verse 5. And now, that same presence stood before Joshua. This was a theophany, a visible appearance of God himself. Many scholars believe this was none other than the pre-incarnate Christ, standing as captain of heaven's armies. And he had not come to take sides. He came to take command. Because the question isn't, is God on our side? The real question is, are we on his? Joshua fell face down in worship, not negotiation, not protest, not even a request for victory, just surrender. Because in that moment, the most powerful man in Israel understood, authority only works when it's under authority. This meeting shifted everything. Jericho hadn't fallen yet. No walls had crumbled, no trumpets had been blown, but the real battle was already won. It was won the moment Joshua stopped trying to lead in his own strength and started following the presence of the true commander. What follows next, the fall of Jericho, is iconic. But it wasn't about military strategy, it was about submission. The strategy God gives will sound foolish. March in silence for 6 days, blow horns on the 7th, shout with no weapons drawn. It was a divine declaration that victory doesn't come from might, it comes from alignment. And before Jericho could fall, God made sure Joshua had fallen first. To his knees, to his face, to the only commander who cannot be defeated. And today, for anyone still asking, is God for me? The answer is still, I have come. Not to confirm your plan, but to invite you into mine. The moment had arrived. 7 priests stood ready, their ram's horns in hand. The Ark of the Covenant, God's throne on earth, was lifted high on the shoulders of the Levites. Joshua gave the signal, and the people began to march. No swords drawn, no commands shouted, just silence, and the sound of footsteps echoing around Jericho's mighty walls. Day after day, the same quiet procession. To the soldiers on the wall, it must have seemed absurd, but to the people of God, it was sacred. Because this wasn't a siege, it was a statement. A statement that obedience was louder than weapons, that faith was stronger than force, and that victory belongs to God alone. On the 7th day, everything changed. They circled the city not once, but 7 times. And then came the sound, one long blast from the ram's horns, and the people shouted. Not a war cry, a praise cry, and the walls fell, just like that. Not because of their strength, but because they obeyed the voice of the one who rules over heaven and earth. But here's the secret no one saw coming. The real victory didn't happen when the walls collapsed. It happened before the first trumpet blew. It happened when the people said yes in the wilderness, when they crossed the Jordan in faith, when they circumcised their hearts at Gilgal, when Joshua fell face down before the commander of the Lord's army. The walls of Jericho were just the visible sign of an invisible surrender. And that's what God had been waiting for all along. Because he doesn't need our might, he wants our hearts. He wants a people who will walk when it feels pointless, who will circle walls in silence, who will trust when nothing seems to move, because those are the people who see miracles. And long after Jericho was reduced to rubble, its lesson remained standing. God fights for those who follow him. And when he gives the command, nothing can stand in his way. Not rivers, not giants, not even walls built by generations of pride. It wasn't about land. It was about covenant. And the same God who tore down Jericho still calls us today. To walk by faith, to obey without understanding, to trust even when it seems the walls are winning. Because when your life is aligned with heaven, the victory is already yours, not when the walls fall, but when your heart bows first. The story didn't end with the fall of Jericho. That was only the beginning. Because the greatest conquest wasn't of a city, it was of a generation finally learning how to follow God with undivided hearts. A generation that wandered for decades but chose to believe again. A leader who trembled in the shadow of Moses but learned to walk in God's strength. A people who didn't conquer through might but through obedience. This is what the death of Moses made possible, not the end of a legacy, but the rise of a promise. And maybe that's where you find yourself, on the edge of something, looking across a Jordan of your own. Maybe you've walked through a wilderness of delay, regret, or fear. Maybe you've stood staring at walls that won't move. Or maybe you've mourned the passing of someone or something that once led you, and now you don't know who you are without them. But friend, hear this. God never buries a servant without preparing a successor. He never closes one chapter without opening the next. And he never calls you to cross over without going before you. So don't stop walking. Don't stop trusting, even when you feel small, even when you feel like the last one qualified, even when all you have is obedience and a whisper of hope, because those are the ones he uses. Those are the ones who see walls fall, rivers part, and hearts restored. And just like Joshua, just like Israel, you are not alone. You're being led, even now, by a presence greater than fear, greater than death, greater than any obstacle in your path. So here's your moment. Will you step into it? Will you trust him to bring you through the Jordan and into the life he's been preparing all along? If this story spoke to you, if something in your spirit stirred as you walked with Joshua and remembered Moses, then don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who's standing on the edge of something new, someone who needs to be reminded that the God of Joshua is still moving today. And before you go, leave a comment below. What's the Jordan in front of you right now? And how has this story reminded you that God is already on the other side? If you haven't already, subscribe for more biblical stories that dig deep, stir the heart, and awaken faith. Because we're not just telling stories, we're crossing rivers. We're tearing down walls. We're following the presence, and the best is yet to come.